signal to all these other European countries, or more specifically, it sends a signal to the bank account holders in all these other European countries that are a little bit dodgy themselves in terms of their finances, and it tells them, maybe I shouldn't keep money in a Spanish bank, a Portuguese bank, a Greek bank, an Italian, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can keep going up and down the list. And that's why these governments are now re-panicking, because they suddenly realize if you have bank runs in all these countries, if you have deposit outflight, if you're a Spanish businessman, why would you keep money in a Spanish bank when you could put it in a London bank or a Swiss bank or a Cayman bank or wherever? So there's a lot of anxiety and fear going on right now in Europe. And when you have that short-term fear, and you marry that short-term fear to the long-run fear of the welfare state collapsing, what does that mean? It means that the desire to go after these mythical pots of gold sitting in places like Anguilla is going to become that much more powerful. So with that sort of as an introduction, and I apologize for a long introduction, but the remaining two-thirds of the speech hopefully will actually take less time, let's talk about two specific things that Anguilla and other IFCs have to worry about. The first one is FATCA. And the good news, or I guess bad news, is that I really don't have much to say about this because the issue seems to be lost. I wish I didn't have to say that. I wish that the U.S. wasn't responsible for imposing this upon the world. I wish that the Europeans didn't see this as a way of imposing automatic information sharing upon the entire world. But that seems to be the case right now, that FATCA is a given in the global economy. There are, of course, a couple of different ways to deal with FATCA, but neither one is pleasant. Neither one is conducive to tax competition. We basically have an unfortunate situation, and there's only two possible things that can save the world from FATCA. One is that if China and maybe a few other big countries at the end of the day basically tell the U.S. to go jump in a lake, that could mean that the entire FATCA regime is a little bit unstable. Now, where that would lead, what changes would be made, or would changes be made, that's a political guess, and my judgment on that wouldn't be any better than anybody else's. But it definitely would not be a stable situation for the U.S. and for the sort of international financial and tax structure if China and a few other big countries ultimately just told the U.S. to get lost. The other thing that could happen, although it's years down the road, is if you have political changes of a significant sort in the United States, that's going to open up the entire everything will get reopened, but one of the things that will get reopened is whether or not FATCA is changed or amended. I know I've spent a lot of time up on Capitol Hill talking to House and Senate offices about putting in some sort of safe harbor so that if a country has a tax treaty with the U.S., then automatically FATCA wouldn't need to apply. Because why layer one level of reporting and regulation on top of another? At some point, you should do a cost-benefit test to decide whether it's worth imposing this many costs for this much incremental benefits. If you already have a tax treaty or a tax information exchange agreement, what's the purpose of adding FATCA, especially on top of QI, especially on top of Know Your Customer rules? Now, of course, the answer to some of these questions is that people at the OECD, people at the Treasury departments and finance ministries around the world, they sometimes look upon all these regulations and rules and requirements as a way of basically pricing IFCs out of the market. They figure if they impose so many rules and impose so much expense on you that at some point you'll either no longer be competition for them or you'll be so squeezed that it's really only big institutional investors that have any ability to utilize IFCs. So with FATCA, China, political change in the U.S., those are really the only things that I think might change the current trajectory of where we are going with FATCA. And again, I wish I had something more optimistic to say about that, but we are in a waiting game, either again for China or for political change in the U.S. The thing I really want to focus on as a threat to IFCs is a new thing. The OECD not even 2 months ago, because this was in early February, the OECD put out a new BEPS report. What's BEPS? BEPS is base erosion and profit shifting. This is something that you all should be looking at very carefully with a lot of concern, because if you read this BEPS report that the OECD put out, what they're basically saying is that they want to do, in terms of legal tax planning, what they already did to so-called illegal tax evasion. Because that's what the OECD's first anti-tax competition project was all about. Oh, we have to make sure that people are obeying the law in their home countries, so we have to impose all these rules on IFCs. And so that was their rationale. And in some sense, they could stand on the moral high ground because, oh, we want to make sure people aren't cheating on their taxes. The BEPS project, what makes it so remarkable is they're basically saying, we don't care whether something's legal, we still want to stamp it out. And so if you read the BEPS report, it's all about going after companies, multinational companies especially, but theoretically would apply to all companies. The BEPS report basically says that under the current tax infrastructure around the world, companies have too much ability to do legal tax planning and tax avoidance, and that requires a radical response. And the OECD specifically says in this report that they need outside the box thinking, that they need bold ideas. You know, it's so filled with all sorts of buzzwords, so anything that you read in it, you might want to take with a grain of salt, but it's very clear when they're talking about going, quote, outside the box, unquote, and going beyond what's already in tax treaties. I think it's very clear that at the end of the day, what the OECD would like to do is move to some sort of global formula apportionment system for corporate income. Now, what does that mean? It basically means that if you have a big U.S. multinational, say Apple, Apple right now is a very, or General Electric, or lots of big multinationals around the world. Multinationals are very clever about making sure that they, whether it's their royalties, whether it's their patents, whether it's their intangibles, they have all sorts of ways of trying to make sure that they declare income in low tax jurisdictions and they declare expenses in high tax jurisdictions. Why? Because they obviously have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to maximize their income. And they are doing that completely legally within the context of tax treaties. They're doing it completely legally within the context of transfer pricing rules and all these other policies out there. But because they are doing it effectively, these high-tax governments around the world that are dealing with this short-term desire to find a pot of gold as well as their long-term desire to find a pot of gold, this is causing anxiety among the high-tax governments, and so they want to put in place, in all likelihood, a formula apportionment system. What exactly does it mean? Well, let's take the case of Apple. If, as I suspect will be the case, the OECD ultimately decides that you should have a sales-based formula apportionment system, what they're going to do is they're going to say, well, 21% of Apple sales are in the U.S., 4% are in Germany, 7% are in China. They'll figure out with the reporting requirements what sales are based where, and then they will, in effect, require a global tax return from Apple, or at least global reporting of financial information and sales information, and they will then decide, regardless of what subsidiaries they may have in an IFC, they're going to decide that because 21% of sales occur in the U.S. by value, therefore 20% of Apple's income is in the U.S. Now, what does this do? In effect, it arbitrarily would put in place rules around the world that say that it doesn't matter where Apple actually earns its income, the governments around the world can tax it on the basis of sales. From a practical perspective, what does this do? It means that income that right now is in low-tax jurisdictions like Ireland, Switzerland, and the IFCs, and Singapore and Hong Kong, that income is going to be arbitrarily reclassified as income for Germany and France and the U.S. and Japan. Now, let's think about the implications, because this is where it's going to hit the IFCs hard. If you're a company right now and you're engaged in this completely legal form of tax planning to try to protect the interests of your shareholders, workers,